Good morning again, Elena. Now, the former Liberian president, I should say, Charles Taylor, facing a verdict today for his atrocities. But the media is raising some questions about the whole process of judging him. What are they?
Yes, well, The Economist is raising this question again of whether or not, whatever the verdict is out of this, even if he is found guilty, and that in a sense would be justice being seen to be done, should we be judging African leaders in Western courts to start with? Aren't we implying that African justice isn't not up to the job of judging its former leaders who misbehaved? It's good, of course, they say, that we set this international example of showing that no one has impunity whether or not you are the president. But, of course, it's a criticism that's been levelled against the International Criminal Court also several times, that they only seem to be judging African leaders, that the West is imposing itself on an African process. Is that the right way to be carrying on? Well, The Economist says there's a number of questions that could be raised there. Yes, African leaders do seem to lack a certain amount of enthusiasm for judging those of their predecessors who may have committed war crimes, perhaps because they don't want to set a precedent that could end up seeing themselves in court. But also the West should be looking at the world in an equal sense, and instead perhaps of carting off misbehaving former presidents to The Hague, we should be investing in courts in Africa to enable them to have a fairer and better resourced judicial system there.
Indeed, a very different take on a story we've been covering a lot in the news. Now, we're going to stay in Africa for this next story because the conflict between the two Sudans is also capturing international headlines, is it not?
Yes, there's an interesting article in The Independent where they've been to those states that are currently now in what's now North Sudan, South Kordofan and Blue Nile state, but they still have very rebel movements that are very active there that want those states to become part of South Sudan. Now, that's where there's been the most violence recently. Apparently, according to Human Rights Watch, at least 200 people have disappeared in those states recently, says The Independent, and dozens more have reportedly been killed by North Sudanese soldiers, although North Sudan says it's only holding 10 rebel suspects. So how on earth can this complex conflict then be brought to an end? Well, The Independent says that the answer might be found in an unexpected corner. China, whose president called on the two sides to end the armed conflict recently. Now, they say there's an important diplomatic first for China in here. It's got huge economic interests in this part of the world, of course. It's about the first time that it's had to intervene in this way with a public pronouncement in an African conflict. In the past, they've defended the government of Khartoum against possible resolutions that the UN Security Council tried to pass against it because they wanted to keep getting cheap oil from Sudan. Now they want to keep their investments in both sides safe, and thus it's in their interest to play a kind of peacekeeping role, which would be a first for China in a foreign conflict. Now, The Independent says this could be very interesting because then it would mean China is stepping up to the plate more in a sense like the US does, taking on a political power that could start to be commensurate with its economic power in Africa.
But meanwhile, back home in China, there's a scandal that's just doesn't seem to go away. The case of Bo Xilai and the British businessman Neil Hayward, who was murdered there in China, and that continues to really generate a lot of press coverage.
Yes, it's fascinating people in China and around the world. Bo Xilai, of course, ran Chongqing in southern China and was known as a rising political star in China. Now he's been brought down over his wife having been charged for the murder of this British businessman, Neil Hayward, who was a family friend. He lived in China. Now, the New York Times is looking at this case today, and they've got some new revelations about it, including apparently that Bo Xilai was being wiretapped by the Communist Party central authorities and was in turn hacking into the phones of senior communist leaders, including the president Hu Jintao, which the paper reckons that for the Communist Party leadership, that was his real sin, not his involvement in any particular murder. It was because he was spying on the president. Now, The Guardian's Timothy Garton-Ash says that what's going on in China, is perhaps the most interesting political question in the world right now. And what might the answer be? We don't really know. This case has brought up all kinds of stories about corruption and money laundering in China into not only the international media, but into Chinese state media as well, organs that don't normally talk about the extent of corruption. So despite the fact that this is, on the one hand, been a very entertaining soap for people watching China internationally, it might also lead to really quite strong reforms and progress, he says, because this has been brought to light.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Elena Casas. That was a review of the international press. Let's get a check now of our top stories here on France 24. This cannot